On behalf of the Cultural Affairs Committee, I'd like to welcome all of you here this evening to listen to Bruce Coffin. Bruce is a retired detective from the Portland Police Force. He served more than a quarter century on the police force. At the time of his retirement, Bruce was supervising all of the homicide investigations and, in fact, all of the violent crime investigations for Portland. He also spent 4 years working counterterrorism with the FBI, where he earned the Director's Award, the highest honor a non-agent can receive. Since retirement, Bruce has turned to writing, and he has published 2 novels, Among the Shadows and Beneath the Depths. Both are excellent novels. I've had an opportunity to read both of them. They follow the same protagonist through a number of cases. Obviously, the books are based very much on Bruce's own experiences, but leavened with a great deal of creativity as he's written the novels. He has a third one coming out within the next few months. So I'm very pleased that he's with us here today, and I invite you to welcome Bruce Coffin. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for coming out. I'm not sure what else you'd be doing today. It's Friday, right? So I'm not keeping you from your weekend, I hope, right? As Ed said, I retired from the Portland Police Department in 2012. I had been on the job since 1985. And no, I don't want to know where you were in 1985. I can already guess where that was. So I started out actually with no intention of going into law enforcement. That was actually a switch for me. My career aspirations were to be the next Stephen King. That's actually what I wanted to do. And I attended the University of Southern Maine on scholarships. And I like to joke about it. I'm not sure why I actually needed a scholarship to go to USM in 1982. It was probably $50 a semester back then, but at least it would have paid for my books. And my goal really was to advance my writing ability to the point where I would be able to sustain myself as a novelist. And I ran into a advanced creative writing professor that had a difference of opinion about my writing. He didn't think it was that good. I thought it was. So that really changed things for me. I ended up making the executive decision to become a police officer, really for no other reason other than my uncle had been a career officer for the town of Gorham. Wayne was a Gorham cop for 36 years, actually. It was apparently a slower learner than I. He took that much time to figure out he needed to retire instead of the 28 that I did. But it worked out well. It's funny. One of the things I tell people is that the last short story I wrote in his class. And I was upset with the fact that we didn't see eye to eye. And so I never actually went back to his office to pick up the short stories I had written for him. And I never wrote another piece of fiction for the next 30 years. I joke that there's probably defense attorneys that would argue that point with me, but honestly, I never wrote another fictional piece for 30 years. And the next short story I wrote while I was attempting to write what I aptly named my drawer novel. How many wannabe writers in here, or closet writers? I don't mind outing you. All right, there's a few of you, good. So if you get to the point, if you haven't already, that you get to finish a novel in your life, you will be very excited that you've actually completed a monumental task by completing something along those lines. Writing a novel is not easy. The trick after you've written that novel that goes right in the drawer generally is that you know how to do it. So now the question is, can you write a good one? Well, my first one was not all that good, and it went right where it was supposed to go, in the drawer. But while I was writing it, I got an idea for a short story. And for those of you that do enjoy writing or reading, you know when an idea climbs into your head, sometimes the only way to get rid of it is to actually get it down on paper. Well, this thing was sort of nagging like an abscessed tooth. And I finally decided to put the book away for a couple of days because I thought if I didn't write the idea down for the short story, it was going to drive me crazy. Long story short, it took me 2 days to write what was a fictional 1961 jailbreak story, the old Maine state prison in Thomaston that is no longer there. I find as I get older that most of my stories involve things that are no longer there. It's kind of scary. But there was a Thomaston prison, the state of Maine, before they tore it down, and I decided to write a historical jailbreak story called Foolproof. And this is one of those ideas that just comes from wherever it comes from. I have no idea. I woke up with this idea in my head, and I started writing. It took me 2 days to write this story that ended up being about 6,000 words. And I knew I'd done something good, but I wasn't sure how good it was. And I spent the next year entering this story into different contests and different anthologies, trying to get somebody to publish it. Figured this would be my first thing. My first foray into publication would be a short story. And as the year went on, I was limited to basically becoming a bridesmaid in every one of these contests. I would get a letter or an email back saying that the judges loved what I had written, but didn't think it was quite there yet. And if you want to talk about infuriating, there's no directions that come with that to tell you what it would be that would make it there. But you're almost there, kid. Keep going. That's pretty much what I was getting. And so I had to learn another hard lesson, and that was about editing. And I finally sat down after a year and looked at the story again, and I realized that if I really worked hard at it, I could edit a lot of what I thought might be extraneous material in the story and basically chisel it down to its bare essence. And I finally discovered what editing was when I was able to take that short story and knock it down to 3,600 words. And the curious thing was that happened as I actually still had exactly the same story. And I couldn't believe it. I'd cut it basically by 40%, and it was the same story. The very next thing I entered it into accepted it for publication. And to say that I was excited is an understatement. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Snoopy dance, but I did something very similar to that in my bedroom that I'll deny if anyone ever says it. But what was cool about that was it was the very first thing I ever had published. It was a New England crime anthology called Best New England Crime Stories. And I was excited to be among probably 30-something other writers in this anthology with this story. But the good news actually came 3 months later while I was in the process of negotiating a 3-book contract with HarperCollins for my novel ideas. And I got a letter one day from New York City, and it was from the desk of Otto Penzler's assistant. Otto Penzler, I wouldn't expect any of you to know who he is, but he is Mr. Mystery. He owns a mysterious bookstore in New York City. He has probably the largest first edition collection of mystery stories in the world. All first edition stuff, all signed. He knows everybody. He's published everything. I think the only thing that Otto hasn't done in the mystery field is actually write a novel, a mystery novel. He's done everything else. Well, one of the things that Otto has also involved himself in over the years is for the last 22 years, he has compiled an anthology titled Best American Mystery Stories. And what they do is they read every single published short mystery story from North America the previous year. They whittle that list of somewhere between 3,500 and 5,000 short mystery stories into a best 50 list. And then they bring in a guest author. They've had James Patterson, they've had Stephen King, they've had Elizabeth George, Megan Abbott, you name it, they've had it. And the reason they were sending me a letter was to let me know that the very first short story I'd written in 30 years had been picked to be one of the 20 best published in North America from the previous year. So I still look at this in astonishment, as honored as I am and as exciting as it is to have a 3-book deal with HarperCollins. I look at this first short story that I had published, and it's in there in this book with Stephen King's story, with an Elmore Leonard story, with a Megan Abbott story. And for me, the exciting thing is actually looking at the table of contents and realizing that I'm in this book, that a story I wrote is in this book. And I tell you this really for no other reason other than to let you know that regardless of what your dream might be or the things that you're interested in are, obviously some of you have an interest in law enforcement, which is awesome. And hopefully your teachers are far more nurturing and inspiring than my experience was, and I assume they are. But my point is that whatever it is that you aspire to be when you get out of here and get on with your life, whether it's your career that you're seeking or it's the dream that you have or something creative that you're after, the point is never let anybody squash your dreams and tell you you can't do something. I'm lucky that I'm too stubborn to give up because a professor told me I wasn't very good at it. That basically lit a fire under me, and that's worked very well. I still carry that chip around a little bit here, and it's working good. But not everybody is going to feel that way, so that's the lesson. That, as I say, that was honestly the first short story I had written since college, so it worked out pretty well. I'm guessing I wasn't as good as I thought I was back then, but I probably wasn't as bad as my professor led me to believe. So I went on to law enforcement, and now about 6 months prior to my retirement, for some reason, I got the bug to write again. And that's just how it happened. I have no idea. One day I decided that I was going to sit down, and I found there was a Word app on my iPad, and words just started to fall out. And I went, wow, look at this. I said to my wife, I go, look at this, honey. I can write words and make sentences. This is unbelievable. And there's no typing involved. There's no typewriting. So I started writing, and a story started to spill out. It took me 2.5 years to write that drawer novel. But largely, what that novel was about was, if I was not putting too fine a point on it, I had created a fictional character who was a detective sergeant for the Portland Police Department, and he was in charge of the homicide and violent crime detectives. It's amazing where you get these ideas, these funky ideas, but that's what I came up with, and his name was John Byron. And as time went on, I realized that I really enjoyed the character I had created, but I knew the book wasn't good enough, and so I set out to do it all over again. And basically threw that book right in the drawer, as I told you, and set out to write my next novel, which actually became Among the Shadows. And John Byron, in my thinking, my way of thinking, what I wanted to create was a very realistic portrayal of what it's like to be a detective sergeant investigating homicides and supervising detectives that investigate homicides. And there's a lot of advice you get when you write. One of those things that they like to tell you is that you have to avoid very carefully anything that might be cliche. And so I set out trying to write something quirky because I thought, well, that's what I have to do. That's what everybody told me. Any of you ever watched the television show Monk when that was on television? Great character, great quirky character. Actually, the guy that starred in that, that actually did go to USM, is now in another television show that's on Netflix. It's on Amazon if you get a chance to watch that. But I thought something quirky like Monk might be what I was after, or Dexter, maybe without the serial killing part. But something along those lines is what I tried to do. And then quickly I figured out that if I wanted to tell stories that were as accurate as I could possibly depict for the reader, making a phony character wasn't going to work. It was going to fly in the face of what I was attempting to do. So I decided to throw out the advice and go back to my original plan, which was to give you a police officer who was based largely in part on the people, the men and women who trained me to become a police officer in 1985 and beyond, and the ones I worked with over the years. All their flaws, all their positive traits, all their tenacity, everything that they carried with them that enabled them to be effective police officers and detectives is what I wanted to stitch into John Byron. I wanted to show you the good and the bad of the people that try to do this job. So that's what I set out to do, and I feel like I accomplished that. It's funny, one of the first reviews I got was from a gentleman by the name of Mike Berry. Mike actually hails from this area, but he lives in Berkeley, California now, and he's a professional book critic. And the reason that he got a shot at my first novel was because he was hired by the newspaper to do a review. And they told me that I was going to have an interview with him, and I was scared to death because I thought, well, this is the first critic that's taken a look at my work here. Doesn't matter that my editor likes it or that the other writers like it. What's he going to say? And Mike Berry got back to me and said the thing that he loved the most about the book was how refreshing and how fresh my main character was. And I thought, oh my God, I wrote a cliche and somehow it's fresh. So I guess the answer to that is, and the lesson is, that as long as you do it honestly and you do it well, I think a cliche is a cliche for a reason. We tend to find those types of stereotypes. So John Byron, I thought I'd give you a little bit of a reading here, and then I don't want to talk the whole time. You guys must have questions, so if you don't, think of some while I'm talking. But John Byron, just to give you a little background, is a 20-year veteran of the police department when we first meet him in the first book. He is separated from his wife, who he's been married to for 20 years. Her name is Kay. And he is battling alcoholism, quite honestly. He is in charge, as I said, of the violent crime and homicide detectives. He is tenacious when it comes to chasing down bad guys and righting wrongs. And he's good to his people, but John has some serious flaws. And one of the scenes that I want to read to you gives you a little bit of a taste of who John is. In the first book, Among the Shadows, I wrote this book with the idea that the story itself would give you the biggest glimpse into who John Byron is. And I wanted it to be something that had a historical significance to it, both so that you would learn who John was and who he had become and how he had become that way. John, in my series, is a second-generation Portland police officer. His father, Reese, was a Portland cop before him. And Reese died when John was very young, when he was a teenager, a very vulnerable age to lose a parent. So in the first book, all of that comes back because John is tasked right out of the gate with investigating the murder of a former Portland police lieutenant who was a former co-worker of John's father back in the day. So John, when he was a child, knew this person. And that opens up a whole Pandora's box of feelings and history for John. So that's kind of where this goes. So in this opening, not an opening scene, but in this scene I'm going to read to you, John is attending the funeral service of Lieutenant James O'Halloran. This is in the fall of the year, and he has had to don his dress uniform. Remember, he normally is a detective, so he wears plain clothes like I'm wearing. And so he's had to put the uniform on for this. And that's a little bit of a backstory. I'll read this section, and then we can go from there and see what you think. So. I'm coming apart here. Don't get old, by the way. You can add that to your list of things not to do. The hearing aids are new. And now I don't have any way to deny with my wife anymore that I heard what she asked me to do before she leaves the house. I actually have to do it, so. It was a couple of minutes after 11 Tuesday morning, and Byron stood in dress uniform at the sparsely attended graveside service of former Lieutenant James O'Halloran. The sky was overcast and the air was still thick with summer-like humidity. He counted maybe a dozen current Portland officers and half as many retirees, only half listening to the familiar words of the priest as they drifted by on a warm breeze. His thoughts were occupied by other things, not the least of which were the murder and why Kay wasn't returning his calls. She'd obviously wanted something, so why not leave a message saying what it was? He didn't have time for a prolonged game of phone tag. A warrior for peace, both here and abroad, the priest said. James O'Halloran answered the call, serving his country overseas, then returning stateside where he defended the peace. Byron had attended many police funerals during the course of his career, but he'd never quite been able to stomach them. The truth was, he hated going. It wasn't that he didn't want to show respect for a fallen officer or to honor their service to the community, because he did. His disdain for these funerals went much deeper. Dark thoughts of his own mortality and of those he worked with and cared about would inevitably come creeping in, thoughts he could do without. Memories of his Irish Catholic upbringing intertwined with his father's suicide, the one event that most clearly marked the end of his faith, leaving behind only anger and distrust for all religion. Byron had been 17 years old the day his father committed suicide. It was a warm, sunny afternoon, and he had grabbed his bike and pedaled over to pop in on old Dad. His parents had already split by then. He knew his father would be at home. It was his day off. Byron grabbed his father's uncollected mail from the box out front, then entered the apartment. He yelled out a greeting, but got no response. Worried that his father might be either in the midst of an afternoon tryst or drunk, He quietly searched each room. He found his father slumped over the dining room table. The revolver was lying on the floor. The image never left him. "The Lord is my shepherd," the priest continued. Byron tried to refocus on the murder. The weekend had been largely uneventful, save for 2 more pharmacy robberies, and Frankie Mather's decision not to submit to a polygraph test, effectively closing the door on his cooperation in the O'Halloran case. Byron didn't really believe the simpleton stoner was up to the task of a mercy killing anyway, but it might have been nice to put that theory to the test, seeing as how St. John had already done her part. Mathers felt like unfinished business, and Byron despised anything left undone. "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me." Byron didn't know about anyone's cup running over, but he was pretty sure he could relate to walking in the valley of the shadow of death. It was, after all, his job. There's a little bit of a taste of what John Byron is about. It's kind of a somber scene, actually, when you stop and think about it. I've got a lighter scene, if anybody would like that, too, from the second book. But I tell you that scene largely because there's not a hell of a lot of dialogue in it. Most of it is introspective thought from John, which I like. It really gives you a feel of what he's thinking about as he's here. Writing and actually solving murder cases is very similar in that you're multitasking all the time. Not just what you're physically doing, but also what's going on mentally behind the scenes. The smoke pouring out of the ears. That tends to be the way it works. Try writing a series, actually, and you'll find that the majority of your time, that there's a good percentage of what's happening in your brain is solving plot problems as you're attending different events. So I'm about 10% of that going on right now. But that really is what John is about and what created him the way he is. I actually, as the series goes on, you'll also find that John Byron was an alum here. So I thought that was kind of a cool thing. We haven't got into that yet, but you will. In the third book, it'll make an appearance. So everybody okay with the reading? Can you hear that okay? You want a little bit of a lighter scene? All right, this is good. That was kind of tough, wasn't it? Especially for a Friday afternoon. So in the second book, we have to deal with a despicable creature who's the victim in a homicide. This despicable creature goes by the name of Paul Ramsey. And Paul is a top-notch trial defense attorney. But he's the guy you'd probably want in your corner if you got yourself into some big trouble. But he's not a guy you'd want to hang out with any other time. He's not a good guy. He's not well thought of. And he's got a lot of issues. And somehow, in Beneath the Depths, Paul Ramsey ends up in Casco Bay, floating, and gets pulled up on a lobsterman's trap. So when we find John in this particular scene, John now has a relationship going on with his, probably his best detective on his crew. Her name is Diane Joyner. Diane is really secondary probably in this series. She would be the secondary protagonist, although sometimes she actually tends to carry the story. So secondary protagonists do that. Have you guys all seen, what was the movie with Val Kilmer and Tombstone? You've all seen Tombstone? Did you see how Doc kind of stole the show and it's not really his show? Well, Diane tends to do that sometimes in these scenes. Diane is an African-American detective, formerly from New York City, where she worked as a homicide detective. And Diane has some of her own baggage that she is attempting to escape. And she comes to Portland, Maine, and ends up quickly working her way into CID and becoming a detective for John. And the two of them actually begin to have a relationship outside of work. So when we find them in this second book, that is what's going on, so you'll understand a little bit of this. So Diane and John right now are on their way to Augusta to attend the autopsy for Paul Ramsey when we open up in this scene. Augusta, 60 miles to the north of Portland, houses the office of Maine's chief medical examiner. A small, nondescript brick building tucked behind state police headquarters, almost as an afterthought. Byron had always found the building's placement odd. In the grand scheme of homicide investigation, cause of death was just as essential as proving who had caused it. Byron slid the charcoal gray Malibu into the vacant space next to the PD's black and white evidence van. Pellegroso and Cody were already inside. Diane had hardly uttered 2 words during the 45-minute drive north, and apparently had no desire to break precedent. They walked toward the service entrance in silence. Byron pressed the delivery buzzer. After several minutes, the heavy steel door swung open, exposing a pale, diminutive young man. Nicky, Dr. Ellis's lab assistant, gave a silent nod upon recognizing the detectives. "Hey, Nicky," Byron said. "We're here for the Ramsey autopsy." The skinny lab tech, dressed in light green scrubs and booties, looked at each of them and mumbled something that may or may not have been a greeting. Then he nodded at Byron and said, "Follow me." Byron had never been able to figure out what made Nicky tick, and he wasn't sure he wanted to. Nicky was, to Dr. Ellis, what Igor had been to Dr. Frankenstein. He hardly spoke unless spoken to, and given Diane's current mood, he thought they might make a great pair. Dark circles under his eyes made him look ghoulish, and Byron wondered if Nicky had an actual residence or if Ellis just locked him in a cage at the end of each day. They followed him down a long stock corridor into the viewing room, a glass-walled area that overlooked the examination room. "Greetings and salutations, detectives," Ellis said in his usual theatrical manner. "Welcome to the humble abode of the good Dr. E." "Morning, Doc," they said simultaneously. Ellis might have sounded like a stage actor, but he looked more like an aging rock star. Dressed in medical scrubs, the top of which barely hid his ample belly, he looked somewhere between Neil Young and Elvis, heavy Elvis. Shoulder-length black hair combed straight back with sideburns. "Who is it today, Doc?" Byron asked, referring to the vintage rock concert tees that Ellis always wore. "AC/DC or maybe Leonard Skinner?" Ellis shook his head. "I went online and purchased some new ones." He lifted his smock and smiled proudly. "Fog hat." "Classic," Byron said, nodding in approval. Pellegrosso and Cody stood on the opposite side of the cavernous room near one of the stainless steel exam tables. Cody was pacing like an expectant father. On top of the table lay the bright yellow body bag containing the remains of their floater. Byron looked at Cody's face, noting with amusement that the flushed excitement previously occupying the rookie's cheeks while they'd been aboard the boat had been replaced by a sickly green pallor, similar in hue to Ellis's scrubs. The examination room was spotless. The 12-foot-high concrete block walls were painted entirely in white, with the exception of the bottom 4 feet, which were done in subway tile. Scores of white metal cabinets and rows of shelving had been affixed to the walls, each containing various supplies and implements of deconstruction or destruction, depending on one's point of view. Half a dozen gleaming stainless steel exam tables were scattered throughout the room, each with its own digital hanging scale for weighing organs. The harsh fluorescent lighting made everyone in the room look clinical and cold, even the living. In the world of police investigations, post-mortem examinations were considered a rite of passage, albeit a morbid one. With the exception of Cody, they had each attended countless autopsies, and although they were all focused on the matter at hand, Byron could see from the expression on everyone's faces, including Ellis's, that they were all secretly looking forward to the rookie's reaction. Even Diane's mood seemed to have improved as she eyed the young officer. Ellis began the exam by gloving up and donning an apron. Carefully, he unzipped the bag containing Ramsey's remains, releasing the foul, fishy odor of decomposition. Rivulets of water ran onto the table, forming reflective pools. A pair of silver dollar-sized black crabs skidded from the bag to the table and dropped down to the concrete floor. The unlikely stowaways had evidently secreted themselves somewhere inside the remains, continuing to feed during transport to Augusta. Byron glanced over at Cody, whose face was now as white as a sheet. Pellegrosso, having taken up a position behind the young officer, caught him easily before he could collapse to the floor. Byron and the others carried Cody into a nearby office and laid him on a sofa, while Ellis waited with a satisfied grin on his face. Byron returned to the exam room, making a mental note to avoid seafood for the foreseeable future. A lighter one, I guess, right? We went right to an autopsy. That scene actually was fun to write. These books and these stories are entirely fictional, but the luxury of having almost three decades in that job is that I get to populate these stories with things from my own past and things from the past of my coworkers who experience a lot of this kind of stuff. And I wanted to get a scene in there that actually covered that rite of passage of taking a brand new officer up to an autopsy. That is one of the highlights of that job, I have to tell you. We all had our first shot at it, but it's always fun to see somebody who's excited about going up, and then when they get there, it's not quite as exciting as they imagined. That particular one, I had one in mind that I was thinking about as I wrote that scene. We had picked up an officer, a lateral transfer from California, LA County actually. And that officer was always squared away, always had the highest polish on the boots, the whole thing. It was actually almost comical. It looked like he should have had tags on the uniform. Everything looked so new. And he also had a propensity for pointing out, not understanding that he needed to be a little more humble, having come to our fine city. He apparently thought because he came from California that he knew far more than we do in our little burg in Maine. And so when he was being trained and brought up to speed on Maine law and how Portland does things, it was common to hear him say, well, that's not how we do it in LA. And I remember a specific night where he was riding with his training officer and actually being given the task of driving, so the training officer was a passenger, and apparently regaling his training officer with a story about something to do with California and not paying attention as he pulled out in front of an oncoming car and was promptly T-boned. Nobody was hurt, but before the last tinkle of chrome hit the pavement, the training officer looked over at him and said, "Is that how they do it in LA, sport?" So that was the officer we took with us up to the autopsy. It was his first, and it made sense actually to take him up. He had to get fitted for more uniforms, so we had to take him to Wise, which is up in Gardner at that time, to get measured. And he was excited about the prospect of going to an autopsy, so we took him up with us. This is when I was part of a fatal accident investigation team, so the autopsy we were going to was for a victim of a fatal accident. And we made sure as soon as we arrived at the medical examiner's office that the ME, who was going to be conducting the autopsy, was well aware that we had a newbie in our midst. She was very excited about that prospect, and I could tell from the gleam in her eye that she was about to put on a show. One of the things that medical examiners have that's slightly off, I guess like police officers, is that they actually enjoy not only finding the cause of death in those kinds of cases, because that's obviously the reason they're in there, but they also want to find out what other weird things we've done to ourselves over our lives. It's like a mechanic ripping the engine apart to find out what you've got wrong. This is what your doctor would do to you if they could actually do it without killing you. They want to know all the stuff that's happening in there, not just some scans. They want to see it. So they're kind of like that person in your family that loves to disassemble mechanical things to figure out how they work, but doesn't necessarily actually put them back together. It's like that. So this particular gentleman had stones that he had not passed. I have never had the pleasure, and having seen how that went down that day, I don't ever want the pleasure. But apparently the doctor was aware that stones like that are very brittle. I wasn't aware of it, and apparently neither was the brand new officer that we had dragged up with us to the autopsy. So with a smile on her face, she held up one of the stones and then waved the new officer over. And as he leaned in his brand new shiny uniform, she squeezed the stone and it exploded. And as he danced away, looking like Michael Flatley from Lord of the Dance, or somebody flicked a live cigarette at him, we absolutely broke up. And I still remember that to this day. So some of that was floating through my head as I wrote that fictional scene that I just read to you guys. So there are obviously a lot of funny things that do happen on the job. The gallows humor plays a large part in these books. It's really great comic relief. You can tell just from those two scenes I read to you that some of these get a little heavy. The topics get a little heavy. But as I told you at the beginning, the goal here is to be able to show you the good and the bad of all of this and how stressful these investigations actually are and how much is at stake. Murder cases really are the ultimate crime to try and solve, because if you look at it in terms of, everybody understands the crime of theft, whether it's fraud or burglary or actually having your car broken into your house. Everybody understands actually physically having something taken from you. Well, there's no greater theft than actually stealing somebody's life from them and cutting it short. So there is a great deal at stake, and the homicide investigators have the ultimate task to try and bring justice to that crime. So I could babble on all day. Ed knows me. He knows I could do that. So, but I want to open the floor up for questions, and you can ask almost anything. If I don't want to answer it, I can either tell you a lie or I can move on to something else. But you can talk about police work, the writing, any of that stuff that you want to talk about. Any questions? Yes. The question was whether or not I regret changing career paths after having my brush, my unnurturing brush with a professor. Yes and no. You know, I think if you'd asked me that question 15 years ago, I would answer that yes, absolutely yes, because I always wanted to be a writer. I will say now that I've looked back on this, and I think really, whether he intended to or not, he did me a huge favor. And that favor was that one of the things that would have been missing from my writing back then that is now front and center is I had not had a life. If you stop and think about it, you know, you guys are about the age that I was when this was happening to me. And although I felt like I knew everything, and maybe I did, I don't know. My parents somehow got smarter the older I got. I don't know how that works, but I hadn't really done much. And I look back on it now and I think to myself, all the things I've experienced since that time in my life, and that some of that is outside of the job of police work. Some of it is just life in general. You know, knowing what it's like to experience real loss, knowing what it's like to experience real love, losing relatives, losing friends, you know, horrible things happening in your life. Dealing with trauma, dealing with the birth of you know, new family members, all the highs and the lows that everybody goes through in life. Knowing what it's like to have to make ends meet and pay bills. I hadn't done any of that stuff. And quite frankly, it didn't take a lot to have my motivation eroded. That one professor probably is somewhat of that as an excuse, only because that was my focus for college. But the reality is I had a lot of distractions back then, as I'm sure you do. I married one of them. Don't tell her if she says anything, but and that's true. I mean, that's absolutely true. One of the things that would have been missing from my writing is real life. I had not experienced anything. So what I would have had to have written about is what other people do. And I think that would have lost that air of authenticity that I hope I have instilled in my work. One of the things that I find that people come to me and tell me is that I describe something that they themselves have experienced in very detailed form. And it evokes that emotion in them again because I know what I'm talking about, having done it myself. And I think that's something that you can't learn in a classroom. There's no question about it. As I read other books now, I can tell the difference between somebody who's giving me something that they got secondhand or something they've written down that they themselves have experienced. There's no question about it. And I don't know if there's any way I could have substituted that. I think my writing is better for it. I think the only thing that I do regret is that I really just walked away from it. I felt like, well, that was it. So I never worked on it. I didn't do anything at all until 6 months before I retired. Now, a smarter person would have actually probably been taking notes as I went through my career, but trust me when I tell you, all that stuff is imprinted. So no, I guess it's sort of a yes and a no. Like I say, the chip that he put on my shoulder has served me well because that has continued. One of the things you'll find if you ever try to get into this or something else that's very hard to pull off is that you'll get a lot of advice from a lot of different people. When my friends and relatives found out that I was attempting to write a book again, that I was actually going to go for it, they well-intentioned comments, you know, well-meaning comments, but there were a lot of things like, it's really tough to do. You might have to self-publish, and, you know, it's really hard to get out there and do a traditional thing, and you should think about alternatives. They meant well, but what I heard was my writing still wasn't good enough to ever get published traditionally. Well, I went home after hearing that a couple of times and told my wife that I would never self-publish after hearing that because I had something to prove, as I did to the professor. And so for me, I wanted traditional publication or nothing. And I was very lucky. Timing worked out well. The writing was high enough. I had some help from other writers who gave me a lot of advice and a lot of criticism along the way. Kate Flora is one of those. I don't know if any of you have read her work, but she is a phenomenal writer. She's done some true crime stories. She wrote the book with my former boss, Joe Laughlin, called Finding Amy. And if you ever get a chance to read that book, that is based on a real live murder that I actually took part in, that we worked on. Amy St. Laurent was murdered, kidnapped from the Old Port, murdered, and then her body was buried in Scarborough. And that was a long, arduous case for everybody involved. But that's a really good book if you want to read something about how it really works without the fiction involved. So, but I think that's probably that's the way I would answer that question. How's that for a long answer? See, now you know why I'm a novelist and not a short story writer anymore. So, anybody else dare to ask a question? Yes. How was going to my first autopsy, and does it get easier over the years? You know, people ask me that question, and quite honestly, I don't remember my first autopsy. I'm sure I was picked on, but I think the problem is it just sort of gets old in a hurry. I did it so often that it really sort of goes away. I do remember there was a character by the name of Dr. Henry Ryan, who I almost chose to create my Dr. Ellis character. He was a throwback. And I can remember him coming to the academy when it was still in Waterville and teaching us classes and showing us all those gruesome autopsy photos, which, by the way, I can tell you that those pictures don't do the actual physical presence justice. There's no odor in a slide, so you don't have that to contend with. And there's no sounds to go with what actually happens in there. But Henry Ryan was great. He was a throwback. He smoked a pipe. He had the big, thick glasses. I'm not kidding you, he would eat while he was telling you what was going on. He would eat a sandwich and stuff. And I'm just thinking, nah, that just doesn't work for me. I'm not sure, was that a clean hand? Was the glove, it sort of gets confusing. But he was a great guy to learn from. When he came to the academy, one of the things he brought with him was some pickled brains that he had in jars for us to see. And I remember people saying, well, what did you bring with you, Doc? And he's like, brains. And I'm thinking, all right, I got to do this for a living. This is going to be awesome. I can tell where this is headed. So it does get easier. I can say that for me, autopsies are sort of an odd thing. I'm not a real religious guy. I wasn't raised that way. I'm sort of all over the place. I was raised Methodist, and I'm not sure what that means. I feel like I'm that dog you can't really put a breed on. But I think over the course of a career, it really tends to do a lot of things to your psyche. Getting to see the bad things that people are capable of doing to each other on a daily basis really takes a toll. Spiritual, I've managed to hang on to that, thank God. I think that's one of the things that gets most of us through what we do. And I have to believe in other things. There's no question about it. I believe in other things. But I will tell you that one of the first things I do remember about an autopsy, and it has stuck with me, and I don't know what any of your proclivity is to that. I don't know how any of you feel about things or how passionate you are about the topic of religion. But I will tell you that it's easy for me to believe that there is something else. And the reason I say that is because, like all of you, I attended biology class. And maybe you even put models together. And I remember every organ had its own color, right? It was color-coded. And you're like, oh, this is cool. This is what color the liver is. The lungs are green. This is going to be awesome. And when I actually saw a live body cut open for the first time, and I was looking for answers to my own personal questions, I didn't see any. There was nothing there. The brain, quite honestly, looks, when the blood is drained out of it, looks like a gray ball of macaroni and cheese. There's no answers. And when they cut it open, there's no electrodes, there's no microchips, there's no nothing. There's nothing there that looks like it would do any of the things that we all do. Think about this. Every time I see an autopsy, there's somebody lying on the table. That person had a life. They loved somebody. They hated somebody. They held a job down. They raised a family. They went to hear an author speak. They did all of those things. They drove a car. And yet, on the table, there's nothing there. It's nothing. It's just a shell. So it was an odd thing to have that happen to me. That was the first thought I had as I'm watching this. I was looking for the answers I was looking for. The cause of death is always interesting. But what made all that get up and do what it did, to me, was beyond belief. So it sort of had an odd effect on me. And I think a lot of police officers feel that way. So I guess the answer is that we don't have all the answers. So, but it is a fascinating thing. I will say the only time that I really never looked forward to it, and I know this was universal for all law enforcement, a great many of the people, as you might imagine, that ended up on a table for an autopsy that we went to, some of them put themselves there by their own actions, by their own craziness, by their own, hey guys, watch this. I mean, that stuff happens. And so it was harder for us, I think, to feel that empathy for that person when that was the case. When they were the victim of a crime, obviously that's an entirely different thing, and it becomes emotional. And you're there on behalf of the family that's still surviving that person, that wants answers and wants justice. And then there are the times where it's a young person, a child, not to put too fine a point on it, and those never get easy. Those are very hard to deal with. You ask yourself a lot of questions, and one of them is why. Like I say, there are people that put themselves on that table, no question about it. We all do dumb things, and some people make a lifetime habit out of that. But when you're a little kid and you haven't been around long enough yet to have done anything to anybody, those are tough to watch, tough to deal with. And we really focus on those because you want to make sure you don't miss something. If there is somebody to blame for what had happened, we want to make sure we get that person and hold them accountable. So. Yes, anyone else? Yes, way up in the back. Yep. Did you say you've been reading them? Okay. He's still writing them, so just so you know. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Um, I, I'm not going to be able to repeat that whole question, but basically, what she's asking, this is for the recording, what she's asking is whether or not I have used real life events to help populate the backstory behind my novels, similar to what Michael Conley does in the Hieronymus Bosch series. And it's sort of a yes and a no. I will tell you that the books you're referencing that you read 20 years ago, writing novels, fiction novels in the crime field, probably in a lot of fields, was much different 20 years ago than it is now. Ed and I were just discussing how much things had changed in the world in the last even 10 years. And so I think that's a delicate balance. There are things I write about that get into different topics, obviously. I have an African American female secondary protagonist in this series, and that allows me a vehicle to actually explore a number of things that I firsthand am aware of, having done that job for 30 years, and working with people a lot like Diane Joyner and seeing what they went through and talking to them and talking about things. So there are things that I like to explore. I want to try and keep these books as fictional as possible. There may be overlap to things that happen in real life, but I try not to go too far down that road. I think one of the dangers in fiction is there's a good and a bad to that. One is that it is fun to explore, I think, things that are happening in real life and things that affect all of us. But you have to, I think, as a writer, try and keep that in perspective with the fact that you are writing fiction. And the idea behind fiction, the reason I don't write true crime is because I had enough of that in my 30 years on the job. Fiction for me, even though I'm writing about murders and horrible stuff happening, is an escape, and it's cathartic in that it allows me to put the world right. There are cases I worked in my career that we haven't solved, or maybe we have solved them, but we can't bring the killer to justice because we don't have enough to assure ourselves of a conviction. And so we hang there waiting for something else to happen. And that's a tough thing to live with. In my books, the good guy or the good girl always wins, at least in the end. And I have to solve these cases in 400 plus pages. That's just the way it works. In real life, it doesn't work that way. And I do like to incorporate things in, I think, if they matter and they're specific. I think the one thing that I try to do, and I know a lot of other writers, because we have discussed this actually, Paul Dworin and I talked about this. I don't know if any of you are familiar with his books. He writes a mystery series where the protagonist is a Maine game warden by the name of Mike Bowditch. And Paul is, I think his 9th book comes out this summer or something like that. Paul's got a great character who starts as a young, impetuous law enforcement officer, and he really does a lot of things wrong and then kind of cuts his teeth and starts to grow into himself as the series goes on. In one of the early books that I read, Plum Creek really was the backstory behind the book that he wrote, which was called, can't think of what it was called now, Massacre Pond. That's it. I've used up all my brain cells for the rest of the day. It's Friday afternoon, so. But Massacre Pond and Plum Creek, if you remember this, was a big point of contention in northern Maine not too long ago. And it had to do with land use. And you had people on one side that thought it was great if they were going to build condos and develop all this wooded area because it was going to bring sportsmen out and there would be, you know, all kinds of stuff going on. People would be running snowmobiles and hunting and doing all this crazy stuff that would help bring money into the state. And then you had the other half who didn't want to see any of that stuff happen because you have pristine lands up there they didn't want touched and destroyed. And so it was a huge thing to talk about and to insert that in the book. Now, Paul wisely didn't call this issue Plum Creek, but it was obvious what he was referring to and how that got done up. And I asked him that specific question. I said, geez, how did you dare to do that? And he pointed out that in all of our books, we all try to do the same thing, and that your protagonist is not you, obviously, but your protagonist starts at point A and tries to figure out who's responsible for what happened. And no matter what gets thrown in their way, they fight through it to get to the answer. That's what happens in every one of these books. That's the whole goal. Or your protagonist wouldn't be worth reading. And so Paul pointed out that the reason he was able to put that in there is because he never took a stance really on it one way or another. Mike Bowditch didn't care about Plum Creek and what those problems were. He understood both sides. What his goal was to find out who had slaughtered these animals. And then, obviously, murders happened and all that other stuff, too. But I think John Byron, I really try to keep that way. I think illuminating issues is always fun. And I think it always gives you food for thought if it's done well. I think the thing that most of us always are cognizant of and try to avoid is actually getting preachy. I don't know, any of you guys watch Law and Order on TV? Any of the fans of that? My wife loves that. I always know when she's home because the first thing I hear is dun dun, you know. But they got a great theme song. Maybe John Byron will have a thing like that someday. But that's the one thing I think that bothers me about that show is that it tends to get preachy. They'll pull things right out of the headlines and make an episode about them. And a lot of the dialogue becomes one side or the other, and people will be throwing out their opinion of it. And I just think you kind of go down a road that not everybody necessarily wants to go to. I think we get enough reality on a day-to-day basis that you're bombarded by between social media and the news and everything else that comes at you. It's nice sometimes to have an escape. And I think, for me, writing fiction does that. Even though I'm writing about murders, I think that kind of gives you an escape. So, does that answer your question? And yes, I am hoping that one day that John Byron will be as well known as Harry Bosch. That would be awesome. So, actually, I did want to bring up a point you made about L.A. One of the things that I get a lot of feedback from, and I'm actually very happy about. My goal initially when I created the series was I actually had thought about creating an imaginary place in Maine where these things take place. I guess John Byron's version of Cabot Cove, if you will. Only it wouldn't be quite so many murders with 30 people living on the coast. But that was really something I thought about because then I wouldn't have to listen to people say, well, that's not the name of that business or that's not what the hospital's called or whatever. But then I thought, if I do that, not only am I going to be wasting, part of this, I'm going to waste the 30 years that I actually spent in a love-hate relationship with the city of Portland. I mean, I love that city to death. There's so many cool things that have happened there. There's so many cool places to go hang out, see shows, and have a drink or whatever. But at the same time, I've seen all the bad things that you'll never see that happen in that city, and I know where they all have happened. I told my wife, I said, if this novel thing doesn't work out, I could buy a 15-passenger van and give one of those tours of death like they do out in California, because I can tell you where it all happened. But I thought, to me, that was the thing I wanted to try to do, was turn Portland into a character, where it's not just a place that this happens, it's actually part of the story. I wanted Portland to be a character. And so I set out to do, when I created this city, the same kind of justice that I felt like Paul Dworin and Jerry Boyle and a couple of the other mystery writers in Maine have done with rural Maine. I wanted to do that with Portland, the city that I knew so well. And right after the first book came out, or just before it came out, Paul Dworin actually reached out to me and said, geez, I don't know if you've got any blurbs lined up for the new book, but I'd love to read it, and if I like the book, I'll write a blurb for you. And I'm thinking, that's awesome, but it's scary as hell, because I wanted to do as good a job as he did in his books, and it's not going to measure up. And he got back to me and said, geez, I love the book, and I got to tell you, that's the best description, the best way of shaping Portland that I'd ever seen. And I'm thinking, well, hit one out of the park. How cool is that? So, and I get that a lot from people that either know the city or are from the city or want to come here on vacation. I can't tell you how many emails I get from other parts of the country of people that want to come visit Portland now because they've read these books. I'm thinking that's sort of a weird side effect. I didn't expect that was going to happen. So maybe I'll be good for tourism, even with all these murders. So that'll be good. Anyone else? Yes. What's that? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. In real life? So if I understand you correctly, your question is, how hard is it when doing the actual police job of maintaining a professional bearing no matter what? I think it's probably similar to the answer I gave you about autopsies. It's learned. It's definitely learned. You get thrown into a lot of weird situations. How many of you actually want to be police officers? Oh my God, wow. There's still time to save you. No, I'm only kidding. Best job in the world, honestly. Best job in the world. You get a front row seat to the greatest show. That's absolutely true. It's not cut out for everybody. There's no question. Not everybody can be cut out to do that job. But if you are one of those people, it is the best job you'll ever have. And I think one of the things that I carry around with me, there's obviously some good and some bad, but one of the things that I carry around with me, even when it wasn't going well, was that there's no other job where you actually get a chance to make an impact on people's lives. I can't tell you how many times we interceded in the middle of a household that was just coming apart and try to make an inroad with the children and maybe separate the adults if that's what needs to happen. You're there when the wheels are coming off, no matter what the scenario is. It could be a bad accident, it could be a burglary to someone's house, and now they feel violated, they'll never feel safe again. This is their house. Maybe somebody's been sexually assaulted. Maybe somebody just lost a child. I mean, you're there for all of that. And so you quickly learn how to be professional and how to stay professional. That's not to say that the chinks in the armor aren't there. They absolutely are. I've got a lot of chinks in my armor. But you learn to kind of get through that so that at least for the time that you're actually there doing the job, you're able to project the professionalism that they're expecting to see and maintain that, not just an illusion of it, actually maintain control. After 28 years, there's definitely some holes in my fabric. There's no question about that. It changes you. You know that you're there, and you know that you're there to make a difference, which is an awesome thing, but it is also an awesome responsibility. And it also means that you're not going to be able to help everybody. You can't save everybody. Most people are responsible for saving themselves. You can try to get people help, you can try to get people justice, and you can try to get people therapy if that's what they need, or a hand up. But at the end of the day, it's incumbent upon society themselves, the people themselves, to actually take care of themselves. You can't do that. And you can't be there all the time for everybody. So I think it's a learned thing. I think when I first started out, I definitely made some mistakes. I definitely had a hard time. And it was much easier for people to push my buttons when I first started out. You have to learn that sometimes the pushback you get is just raw emotion from the people who are suffering for whatever it is that you're there for. Sometimes you have to remember that what you're getting for negative feedback from people is only because you're wearing a badge and a gun, not because of who you are. It's not about that. They don't know you. It's what you represent. And not even what you represent so much as their life is coming apart at that moment, and you're just another symbol of that. So even though you're there to help, it's not always help that's desired at that moment. Sometimes people don't realize they need help. So it's something you learn to do. You'll definitely get better at it. And it's funny because the more of those kind of situations I got into, the more I would reflect on my own life and my own personal interactions with family members or friends. You see the world differently. There's no question about it. And once changed, you're forever changed. You know, my wife always tries to get the chair that has the back to the wall before I get it because she knows how uncomfortable that makes me. That never goes away. You know, she does it just to bust on me, but that's the reality. I mean, there's a lot of things you do. Keeping your gun hand clear. I mean, you learn that from the first days at the academy. You know, if you're carrying something around, you carry it in your weak hand, not your dominant hand. So, but it's just something you have to learn to do. You know. Does that answer your question? One more. All right, one more. Last one. She wants to know if I could give one piece of advice to a college student who is looking to become an officer. Run. No, I'm just kidding. I guess I'll sum this up with a short story. When I started, it was sort of a joke internally. When we knew we were going to be applying to different police departments, and part of the process after you take the test, back then 300 or 400 people would take the test for one opening. I mean, it was ridiculous how hard it was to get into these departments. It's not like that today, I can assure you. But one of the things we would joke amongst ourselves about was we knew we would have oral boards with every department. They would put a group together made up of detectives and officers and brass, and they would throw tough questions at us to see how we would answer. And one of the questions always was, why do you want to be a police officer? And we all said the same thing. We want to help people. Well, the truth was we wanted to ride fast in a car and carry a gun and wear a badge. We thought that'd be really cool, right? Starsky and Hutch, T.J. Hooker, right? Dirty Harry. But the joke was on us. Because about 6 months into that job, and you've already got out of your system the driving fast and the sirens and the lights and carrying the gun, and at some point you realize some of that stuff is just a burden. And the truth was we actually enjoyed going to work every day because we got to help people. So the joke was on us. So my advice to you, if you are seriously considering that for a career, is to know what the cost will be to you. There's no question it will change you. You will see things that other people never see. You will experience things that other people never experience. In a year, you'll do more than most people will do in their lifetime. But if you can keep a handle on that and remember what's important in life and actually care about helping other people, and that's why you go into the job, then you've picked the right career. That's my advice to you. Thank you guys so much. This was awesome. Thank you. Thank you, guys.